Power rarely ends when it is defeated. More often, it ends when it is redistributed so quietly that no single moment feels like an ending at all. Poland did not fall in a single war, nor collapse under one disastrous ruler. There was no decisive siege that closed the story, no last stand that clarified defeat. For years, the institutions remained. The crown existed, the assemblies met, maps still bore the name, and yet, something essential had already begun to thin. The unsettling contradiction is this: Polish power diminished not through sudden conquest, but through a process that preserved the appearance of sovereignty while eroding its substance. Authority remained visible even as it became less decisive. Governance continued even as it lost the ability to bind outcomes. The danger was not that power disappeared, but that it lingered just long enough to be mistaken for survival. What was at stake was not territory alone. It was the relationship between authority and consequence. When that relationship weakens, power can persist symbolically while becoming structurally hollow. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not a marginal state. For centuries, it occupied a central position in Eastern Europe, stretching across vast land and diverse populations. Its political system was unusual by design. The nobility held extraordinary privileges, the monarchy was elective rather than hereditary, and the Sejm functioned as a powerful legislative body. This arrangement was not accidental. It reflected a deep belief that authority should be constrained, that legitimacy required consent, and that concentrated power was a danger to freedom. This inquiry is not a narrative of battles or diplomatic treaties. It is not a moral evaluation of whether Poland chose wisely or foolishly. Instead, it examines how a political structure built to prevent domination struggled to respond when pressure arrived from outside systems that had embraced the opposite logic. The setting is concrete: a vast commonwealth bordered by empires that were increasingly centralized, disciplined, and administratively coherent. To the west, Prussia refined military efficiency and bureaucratic control. To the east, Russia expanded authority through autocracy and relentless territorial ambition. To the south, Austria balanced dynastic legitimacy with imperial administration. Each neighbor was evolving toward tighter command and faster execution. Inside Poland, power moved differently. Decisions required consensus. Authority was dispersed. The liberum veto allowed any noble to dissolve the Sejm by objection, halting legislation entirely. This was not dysfunction by accident. It was restraint by principle. For a time, this restraint functioned as intended. It prevented internal tyranny. It preserved noble autonomy. It slowed reckless decisions. But systems are shaped not only by what they prevent, but by what they enable. Over time, the same mechanisms that protected liberty also limited adaptability. Pressure did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. Military reforms stalled. Taxation became difficult to standardize. Executive authority lacked continuity. External actors learned how to influence internal paralysis without invading at all. Foreign powers funded factions, encouraged vetoes, and turned procedural safeguards into strategic tools. The contradiction sharpened. Polish institutions still operated, but outcomes increasingly reflected external interests. Authority remained internal. Consequence drifted outward. The state appeared intact while losing control over its own direction. This is where erosion becomes visible. Not as collapse, but as delay. Decisions postponed. Reforms discussed but diluted. Threats acknowledged but not integrated into action. Each moment felt temporary, manageable, reversible. The pattern repeated until it was no longer clear when reversal had ceased to be possible. Partitions did not begin as an act of annihilation. They were framed as adjustments, corrections, stabilizations. Territory was reallocated in stages. Administration changed hands while cultural identity persisted. The Commonwealth was reduced, then reduced again. Each partition preserved a rationale that suggested continuity, even as the structural core weakened. Power did not resist effectively, because resistance required coherence. Coherence required authority. Authority required surrendering some of the very restraints that defined the system's legitimacy. This was the paradox. To preserve the state, the system would have needed to become something it was designed not to be. From within, the threat was difficult to perceive clearly. The state still functioned. Diplomats negotiated. Assemblies convened. Legal traditions endured. But power is not measured by ritual alone. It is measured by the ability to translate decision into consequence. That translation was increasingly interrupted. External empires did not merely overpower Poland. They outpaced it. Their systems absorbed feedback faster, mobilized resources more efficiently, and tolerated fewer internal veto points. What they sacrificed in pluralism, they gained in responsiveness. Over time, this imbalance mattered more than any single military engagement. Adaptation arrived late and incompletely. Reforms were proposed. Constitutional changes attempted to strengthen central authority and reduce procedural paralysis. But reform itself triggered resistance from those who equated change with the erosion of liberty. The very groups that had sustained the system now questioned whether survival justified alteration. By the time decisive reforms gained momentum, the surrounding powers no longer viewed Poland as a sovereign actor capable of stabilizing itself. They treated it as a variable to be managed. Legitimacy, once internal, was now externally evaluated. The final partition formalized what had already occurred structurally. The state ceased to exist on maps, but its power had ended earlier, when authority no longer aligned with consequence. What disappeared was not just territory, but agency. This pattern is not unique. Power systems built on restraint often assume time as an ally. Delay feels safe when threats appear gradual, but delay accumulates asymmetrically. External systems do not pause simply because internal deliberation continues. Over time, patience becomes exposure. Yet the lesson is not that restraint is weakness. It is that restraint requires constant recalibration to remain viable under changing conditions. When a system preserves form but resists structural adaptation, it risks confusing continuity with stability. The fracture appears here, inward rather than historical. When does a system designed to prevent domination become unable to prevent erasure? At what point? Does protecting legitimacy undermine survival? And how often do societies mistake the persistence of institutions for the persistence of power itself? Poland did not lose power because it lacked values. It lost power because its values were embedded in a structure that struggled to respond to an environment that no longer rewarded them. The surrounding empires did not need to destroy those values directly. They only needed to outlast the system that housed them. The quiet burn of partition is not only about loss, it is about misalignment, authority without consequence, procedure without outcome, belief without adaptation. These conditions do not announce collapse, they prolong it. Power ends most often not when it is defeated, but when it becomes incapable of adjusting its own limits. The story of Polish power lingers because it resists simple judgment. It asks whether endurance depends less on the purity of a system's principles than on its capacity to translate them into changing reality. And it leaves one tension unresolved: whether power is defined by what it refuses to become or by what it must become in order to remain at all. If this reflection resonated with you, you can find more explorations like this on Timeless Questions, where history, power, and human nature quietly intersect.